One family controlled 70% of all opium flowing into China. Not the British East India Company, not European drug cartels. A Jewish merchant dynasty you've never heard of built a fortune that would equal 200 billion today, owned entire neighborhoods in Mumbai and Shanghai, and had British royalty attending their dinner parties. The Sassoons made the Rothschilds look modest. While the Rothschilds financed European wars, the Sassoons financed something far more profitable and devastating: the systematic addiction of the world's most populous nation. They owned the ships that carried the opium, the warehouses that stored it, the banks that financed it, the trading houses that distributed it. Every single link in a supply chain that pumped 6,500 tons of opium into China annually by the 1880s. But here's what makes this story different from every other robber baron tale you've heard. The Sassoons didn't start in London or New York. They fled persecution in Baghdad as refugees with almost nothing. Within 2 generations, they controlled more wealth than most countries' GDP. They built hospitals, libraries, and universities that still stand today. They were simultaneously saviors of the Jewish community and architects of one of history's largest drug epidemics. The British Empire called them the Rothschilds of the East. Chinese historians call them something far less flattering. Modern Shanghai still bears their architectural fingerprints, though most people walking past Sassoon House have no idea who built it or how. This is the story of how one family weaponized globalization before the word existed, turned human suffering into multi-generational wealth, and then vanished from history so completely that their name means nothing to 99% of people today. The Sassoon family saga ended with British aristocrats scattered across London, their wealth dissipated, their empire dissolved, their name relegated to footnotes in economic history textbooks. Walk through Mumbai's Kala Goda district today, and you'll see Sassoon Library, Sassoon Docks, and David Sassoon Clock Tower. Ask locals who Sassoon was, and most shrug. The dynasty that once employed 20,000 people across Asia, that financed the development of modern Hong Kong and Shanghai, that married into British nobility and hosted the Prince of Wales, has been scrubbed from popular memory so thoroughly it's almost suspicious. But rewind to 1832. David Sassoon, 40 years old, arrives in Bombay with his wife, 8 children, and whatever wealth he could smuggle out of Baghdad. He's fleeing the Ottoman Empire's new governor, Dawood Pasha, who's been systematically persecuting and extorting Baghdad's Jewish community. The Sassoons weren't poor. David's father had been the Ottoman Sultan's chief treasurer for Baghdad province, but they also weren't carrying the kind of capital that builds empires. They had connections, trading knowledge, and fluency in Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, and Hindustani. Bombay in 1832 was the British Empire's western gateway to India. The East India Company controlled trade. Parsi merchants dominated the commercial networks. A Jewish refugee from Baghdad should have remained a minor player, maybe established a modest trading house, lived comfortably but not legendarily. Instead, within 15 years, David Sassoon would establish a network spanning Bombay, Calcutta, Canton, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and London. Within 30 years, his sons would control the majority of British trade with China. Within 50 years, the Sassoons would be so wealthy that when Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, visited India in 1875, he stayed at the Sassoon mansion and called them personal friends. What most people don't know is how they did it. The gap between refugee merchant and economic superpower does not close through normal business practices. The Sassoons identified the single most profitable commodity in 19th century global trade and built a vertically integrated empire around it, with ruthless precision. They saw what the British government wanted, tax revenue from Chinese trade, and what the Chinese population was developing, mass opium addiction, and positioned themselves as the indispensable middlemen. Behind the libraries and hospitals David Sassoon funded, behind the reputation as a pious Jewish patriarch who never worked on the Sabbath, was a business model of staggering moral complexity. The same man who gave 10% of his profits to charity was also flooding China with a drug that would kill millions and contribute to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. The same family that fled persecution would later help the British Empire impose its will on China through narcotics. This wasn't just about making money. It was about understanding power in the age of empires better than the empires understood themselves. The British wanted Chinese tea and silk without spending silver. The Chinese government wanted to stop the opium trade destroying their population. The Sassoons figured out how to give the British what they wanted, while the Chinese were powerless to stop it. Let me take you back to where it started. Not in the opium dens of Canton or the trading floors of Hong Kong, but in a 13th century synagogue in Baghdad, where a family of scholars and merchants made a decision that would change the trajectory of Asian history. Chapter 1. Baghdad Roots. The Sassoon family traced their lineage back to the Iberian Peninsula before the 1492 expulsion. They'd wandered east through North Africa, eventually settling in Baghdad by the 1700s. By the early 19th century, they'd become Nazi, or Prince of Baghdad's Jewish community. Sheikh Sassoon ben Saleh served as the chief treasurer to the pashas governing Baghdad, a position of enormous influence and substantial danger. You need to understand what being a court Jew meant in the Ottoman Empire. You managed the pasha's finances, collected taxes, administered trade contracts. You became wealthy, yes, but you also became a target. When a new governor needed money quickly, he'd often arrest and torture the Jewish treasurer until the family paid ransom. When public anger needed redirecting, Jews made convenient scapegoats. Sheikh Sassoon ben Saleh understood this reality intimately. He kept his family prepared for sudden departure. He diversified assets. He maintained connections across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. When he died in 1828, his son David inherited not just wealth, but a sophisticated understanding of how to operate in politically unstable environments. David Sassoon was 36 years old, married with children, already managing significant trading operations. He was religious, scholarly, and according to contemporary accounts, possessed an almost supernatural ability to assess risk and opportunity. He spoke 7 languages. He could calculate complex financial arrangements in his head. He never forgot a face or a deal. Then Dawood Pasha took control of Baghdad in 1817. Dawood Pasha was reformist, brutal, and perpetually short of money for his military campaigns. He looked at Baghdad's wealthy Jewish community the way a farmer looks at ripe fruit. Between 1828 and 1832, he systematically extorted Jewish merchants, imprisoned community leaders, and made life untenable for anyone with visible wealth. David saw what was coming. The same pattern that had played out across centuries of Jewish life in the Islamic world: tolerance until the government needed money, then persecution. He began quietly moving assets, converting properties to portable wealth, establishing contacts in Bombay, where the British East India Company was expanding operations and actively recruiting merchant talent. In 1832, David made his move. He left Baghdad with his immediate family, arriving in Bombay with enough capital to establish a modest trading house, but nowhere near enough to dominate markets. He was one refugee merchant among hundreds in a city full of established Parsi, Hindu, and Muslim trading networks. What David had that others didn't was timing and vision. The British had just won the first Opium War against China. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 would open 5 Chinese ports to foreign trade, cede Hong Kong to Britain, and most importantly, force China to accept British opium imports. David saw the opportunity 10 years before most merchants understood its scale. He also had something else: family. David brought his sons into the business immediately. Albert, Elias, and later Solomon would become the operational backbone of Sassoon and Company. Jewish family businesses had structural advantages in 19th century global trade. You could trust relatives with large amounts of capital. You could send sons to distant ports without worrying about embezzlement. You could operate across time zones and languages because family members could switch between Arabic, Hebrew, English, and Chinese dialects. David established Sassoon and Company in 1832, initially trading cotton, silk, and spices, standard merchant goods. He operated conservatively, building reputation, establishing credit, learning the British commercial system. He attended synagogue faithfully, gave generously to charity, became known as a pious, honest merchant. British officials appreciated his fluency in multiple languages and his ability to navigate between British, Indian, and Middle Eastern commercial cultures. But while David was building his respectable merchant identity, he was also watching carefully. He saw how much money the East India Company made from opium exports to China. He saw how the British government taxed those exports. He understood that post-Opium War China would be forced to accept dramatically increased drug imports. He recognized that whoever controlled the opium supply chain would control the most profitable trade route in Asia. By 1843, David had made his decision. Sassoon and Company would pivot to opium, not as a side business, but as the core operation. He would build a network that controlled every stage, purchasing raw opium from Indian growers, processing it, shipping it, distributing it in China, and banking the profits. He would effectively become a private opium monopoly operating under British imperial protection. His sons thought he was taking enormous risk. Opium trade was controversial, even in 1843. Many respectable merchants avoided it. The Chinese government desperately wanted to stop it. Military conflict remained possible. Why risk the family's growing reputation on something so morally questionable? David's answer was simple. The British Empire needed opium revenue to fund its operations in Asia. China's government was too weak to stop it. The profit margins were 10 times higher than legitimate trade goods. Anyone with the infrastructure to scale opium distribution would become unfathomably wealthy. The moral question didn't factor into his calculation. He sent his eldest son Albert to establish operations in Canton and Hong Kong. He sent Elias to Shanghai. He kept Solomon in Bombay to manage the Indian supply side. Within 5 years, Sassoon and Company had offices in every major Chinese port and controlled shipping routes across the Indian Ocean and South China Sea. But this wasn't the end of David's ambition. What he'd built was just infrastructure. The real empire would require something more sophisticated, a system that made the Sassoons indispensable to both British imperial policy and Chinese market demand. A system so embedded in the economic architecture of Asia that dismantling it would collapse trade networks across 2 continents. That system was about to emerge in Shanghai, where David's vision would meet Chinese desperation and British imperial indifference to create a drug empire of unprecedented scale. Chapter 2. Shanghai Empire. Shanghai in 1845 was a fishing village being forcibly transformed into a global trading port. The Treaty of Nanking designated it one of 5 treaty ports where foreigners could trade, establish businesses, and live under their own laws. The British established the international settlement. The French created their own concession. Chinese officials watched, powerless under the terms of the treaty they'd been forced to sign. Elias Sassoon, David's 28-year-old son, arrived in Shanghai in 1844 with clear instructions. Establish the family's dominant position before other merchants realized Shanghai's potential. He rented warehouse space. He hired local agents who spoke Shanghainese and understood regional networks. He established banking relationships with British firms. He did everything a legitimate merchant would do. Then he started building the opium infrastructure. You see, opium trade in China had a unique problem. Chinese law still officially banned it. The British had forced China to accept imports, but they hadn't legalized distribution. This created a grey market. Opium ships anchored offshore. Chinese smugglers bought the cargo, distributed it inland, and everyone pretended the system didn't exist. Elias recognized the inefficiency. Why let Chinese smugglers take the distribution profits when Sassoon and Company could control the entire chain? He established a network of Chinese compradors, local agents who handled the illegal portions of distribution while keeping the Sassoon name officially clean. He bought properties that could serve as discreet storage facilities. He cultivated relationships with Chinese officials who could be bribed to look the other way. Within 3 years, Sassoon and Company dominated Shanghai's opium trade. They weren't the only merchants dealing opium. Jardine Matheson and Denton Company were major competitors. But the Sassoons had advantages. Their network stretched back to opium production in India, giving them better prices. Their family structure allowed faster decision-making than corporate competitors. Their willingness to operate in legal grey areas exceeded even other opium merchants' comfort levels. By 1850, Sassoon warehouses in Shanghai stored 3,000 chests of opium at any given time. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of processed opium. Do the math. 420,000 pounds of drugs moving through Sassoon facilities annually just in Shanghai. Multiply that by their operations in Canton, Hong Kong, Ningbo and Fuzhou, and you're looking at over £1 million of opium distributed by one family's business in a single year. The profits were staggering. David Sassoon purchased opium from Indian farmers for around 800 rupees per chest. After processing and shipping, Sassoon and Company sold it in China for 2,500 rupees per chest. On a single shipment of 100 chests, the family made 120,000 rupees profit, equivalent to roughly $15 million in today's money. They were making dozens of these shipments monthly. But here's what's interesting about how the Sassoons operated differently than competitors. Jardine Matheson and other British firms treated opium as one commodity among many. The Sassoons treated opium as the foundation of a comprehensive empire. They used opium profits to buy real estate across Shanghai. They established legitimate businesses, cotton mills, hotels, trading houses that laundered drug money into respectable enterprises. They built infrastructure that made Shanghai dependent on Sassoon capital. Elias purchased land in what would become Shanghai's most valuable commercial districts. He built the first Western-style buildings in the international settlement. He established the first foreign bank in Shanghai with branches connected to Bombay and London. He created a system where Chinese merchants, British officials and international traders all had to interact with Sassoon enterprises, whether they were buying opium or not. The brilliance of this approach was strategic insulation. When anti-opium sentiment grew in Britain, the Sassoons could point to their legitimate businesses. When Chinese officials complained about drug distribution, the Sassoons could claim they only sold to Chinese merchants. What those merchants did afterward wasn't Sassoon responsibility. When competitors tried to undercut them on opium prices, the Sassoons could temporarily accept losses because they had real estate and banking profits to sustain them. David watched his sons build this empire from Bombay with patriarchal satisfaction. He'd been right about the opportunity. He'd been right about the British government's willingness to protect opium trade despite moral objections. He'd been right that China's government was too weak and too corrupted to effectively resist. By 1853, Sassoon and Company employed over 3,000 people across Asia. They owned 15 ships. They had offices in 8 cities. They controlled an estimated 70% of opium imports into central and southern China. The company David had founded with modest refugee capital had become one of the most powerful economic entities in Asia within 20 years. And they were just getting started. The Second Opium War was coming, and when it ended in 1860, the Treaty of Tientsin would open even more Chinese ports, legalize opium imports, and effectively give foreign merchants unlimited access to Chinese markets. The Sassoons would be positioned to exploit this opening better than any competitor. But with explosive growth came new complications. The family was expanding faster than David could maintain centralized control. His sons were becoming independently wealthy, developing their own visions for the business. Competition from other opium merchants was intensifying. And there was the unavoidable reality of what their wealth was built on: millions of Chinese opium addicts whose addiction financed every Sassoon library, hospital and synagogue. What nobody knew was that the same opium trade making them rich would also tear the family apart. The sons who'd built the empire would eventually fracture the dynasty in ways David never anticipated. The seeds of that destruction were already planted in the Shanghai warehouses, where £1 million of drugs sat waiting for distribution. Chapter 3. Opium Monopoly. Let me put this in perspective. By 1865, opium imports into China reached 6,500 tons annually. The Sassoons controlled approximately 70% of that market. That's 4,550 tons of opium, equivalent to £10 million of drugs, moving through Sassoon supply chains every single year. To visualize this, if you loaded all that opium into modern shipping containers, you'd need 450 of them. The Sassoons were running what would today be classified as the largest drug cartel in human history, except it was completely legal under British imperial law. Here's the thing about opium monopolies. They don't happen by accident. The Sassoons didn't just outcompete rivals through better business practices. They systematically constructed a supply chain so comprehensive that competitors couldn't function without interacting with Sassoon infrastructure at multiple points. Start with production. Opium cultivation in India was controlled by the British East India Company, which operated government monopolies in Bengal and Bombay. The company grew the opium, processed it into smokable form, and auctioned it to merchants. The Sassoons cultivated such close relationships with company officials that they received preferential treatment at auctions. They got advance notice of auction dates. They got better credit terms. Sometimes they got to inspect opium quality before competitors. How did they manage this? Simple. They made themselves useful to British officials. David Sassoon hosted company administrators at his Bombay mansion. He provided interest-free loans to officials facing cash shortfalls. He donated generously to British charitable causes. He made sure every important company official owed him favors. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. It was the way business worked in the 19th century British Empire. Personal relationships determined commercial success. Move to shipping. The Sassoons owned their own fleet by the 1860s, 15 ships initially, growing to 30 by 1870. This gave them schedule flexibility competitors lacked. Jardine Matheson and Denton Company often chartered ships, meaning they paid shipping costs that cut into margins. The Sassoons paid once to build ships, then used them indefinitely. On high-volume routes like Bombay to Shanghai, this translated to 15–20% cost advantages. Their ships also served intelligence purposes. Sassoon captains reported market conditions in every port, current opium prices, competitor activities, changes in Chinese enforcement policies. This information flow meant the Sassoons always knew where demand was highest and could redirect shipments mid-voyage to maximize profits. Competitors operating with chartered vessels couldn't match this flexibility. Consider warehousing. The Sassoons owned storage facilities in every major Chinese port. These weren't just buildings. They were fortified compounds with armed guards, secure vaults and direct dock access. Chinese smugglers knew Sassoon warehouses were safe, reliable, and always stocked. This reputation meant the Sassoons could charge premium prices because buyers trusted product quality and availability. Here's what most people miss about the warehouse network. It was also a lending operation. Chinese merchants would buy opium on credit from the Sassoons, distribute it inland, and repay with interest. If they defaulted, the Sassoons would seize their assets, shops, properties, whatever had value. Over time, the Sassoons accumulated massive real estate holdings across China, not through direct purchase, but through defaulted opium loans. They were simultaneously drug dealers and predatory lenders. The final monopoly layer was banking. The Sassoons established E.D. Sassoon Banking Company in 1867, operating across Bombay, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and London. This bank financed opium purchases, handled currency exchange, and processed trade settlements. Competitors who didn't want to use Sassoon banks found themselves at disadvantages. Longer processing times, worse exchange rates, higher fees. Think about it. If you were a merchant trying to compete with the Sassoons in 1870, you'd face higher opium purchase prices, higher shipping costs, no guaranteed storage, worse intelligence about market conditions, and more expensive banking services. The Sassoons had engineered systematic advantages at every stage. Breaking their dominance would require matching their infrastructure across 4 countries and a dozen cities simultaneously. No competitor had that kind of capital or political access. But here's where it gets ethically complicated. The same efficiency that made the Sassoons business geniuses also made them devastatingly effective at spreading addiction. Their reliable supply chains meant opium was always available in Chinese markets. Their credit systems meant poorer Chinese could access opium even without ready cash. Their distribution networks reached deep into China's interior, far beyond coastal treaty ports. By 1870, an estimated 10 to 15 million Chinese were opium addicts. That's roughly 3% of China's population. The Qing dynasty was hemorrhaging silver to pay for opium imports, somewhere between 30–40 million silver taels annually, crippling government finances. Chinese productivity was collapsing as addicts spent days in opium dens rather than working. The social fabric was disintegrating. The Sassoons knew exactly what they were doing. They had agents reporting from every province. They understood the devastation. David Sassoon's correspondence reveals a man aware of opium's destructive effects who simply didn't consider it his responsibility. He was providing a product British law permitted. If Chinese bought it voluntarily, that was their choice. If Chinese government couldn't stop it, that was their weakness. This rationalization was common among opium merchants, but the Sassoons took it further. David was simultaneously funding hospitals and schools in Bombay while flooding China with drugs. He was a pillar of the Jewish community, religious, charitable, beloved. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How do you reconcile financing orphanages with causing mass addiction? The answer is you compartmentalize. The Sassoons viewed business and morality as separate domains. In business, you maximize profits within legal boundaries. In personal life, you practice charity and piety. The fact that their profits came from human suffering wasn't relevant to business decisions. The fact that their charity was built on addiction money wasn't relevant to religious practice. This compartmentalization worked because British society accepted it. Opium merchants were respectable. They were invited to royal functions. They received knighthoods. The British government depended on opium tax revenue. By 1870, opium taxes provided 15% of British India's total revenue. Criticizing the opium trade meant criticizing imperial finances. Very few British politicians were willing to do that. The Sassoons had achieved something remarkable and monstrous. They'd built a business model so embedded in imperial architecture that questioning it meant questioning the empire itself. They weren't just wealthy merchants, they were infrastructural necessities. The British Empire needed Sassoon opium revenue. Chinese markets needed Sassoon credit and distribution. Indian growers needed Sassoon purchase contracts. Meanwhile, across China, millions of addicts needed their next dose, and Sassoon infrastructure ensured supply never failed. The perfect monopoly, one that created its own demand, that governments protected, that was too big to dismantle without economic collapse. But monopolies create resentment. Competitors who couldn't beat the Sassoons started looking for ways to break them. Chinese officials who watched their nation dissolve into addiction started planning resistance, and within the Sassoon family, tensions were building. The sons who'd built the empire were developing independent ambitions. The third generation was coming of age with different values than their refugee grandfather. The monopoly was at its peak, which meant the fractures were about to appear. Chapter 4. British Alliance. The year 1872 marked a turning point, not in Sassoon business dominance, but in their social legitimacy. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, toured India that year. His first stop in Bombay, the Sassoon mansion. He spent 3 days as David Sassoon's personal guest, attended a banquet with 400 guests, and publicly praised the family's contributions to Indian development. This wasn't just courtesy. This was the British monarchy explicitly endorsing the Sassoon Empire. The message to Indian society, to British officials, to international business. The Sassoons were not merely tolerated, but celebrated by the highest levels of British power. David Sassoon had spent 40 years cultivating this relationship. He donated $50,000 to construct the Sassoon docks in Bombay, at the time, the largest wet dock in Asia. He'd funded the Sassoon Mechanics Institute, providing technical education to thousands of Indians. He'd built hospitals, libraries, and schools across Western India. Every building bore his name. Every facility served British imperial interests by creating infrastructure and goodwill. You see, the British had a problem in India. They ruled 300 million people with maybe 100,000 troops and administrators. Legitimacy required more than force. It required convincing Indians that British rule brought progress. The Sassoons provided that narrative. Look at the libraries. Look at the hospitals. Look at the docks employing thousands. The empire delivers civilization. The fact that Sassoon wealth came from Chinese addiction was irrelevant to this narrative. British officials didn't care, and most Indians didn't know. What mattered was visible philanthropy that made British rule seem beneficial. The Sassoons understood this better than most British administrators. They knew power in the 19th century wasn't just military. It was about controlling narratives and relationships. David's sons took this strategy further. When Albert Sassoon moved operations to London in 1858, he didn't just establish business offices. He bought a mansion in London's most prestigious neighbourhood. He joined exclusive clubs. He cultivated friendships with members of parliament. He donated to Conservative Party causes. Within a decade, he was hosting dinners where cabinet ministers, banking executives, and aristocrats mingled. The Sassoons were doing something novel for Jewish merchants. They were assimilating into British high society without converting to Christianity. Previous generations of Jewish financiers, the Rothschilds included, faced social barriers despite their wealth. The Sassoons crashed through those barriers through sheer economic indispensability and strategic relationship building. By 1875, when the Prince of Wales visited India, the Sassoons weren't just wealthy merchants. They were part of the British establishment. Albert Sassoon received a knighthood in 1872. His brother Reuben would be made a baronet in 1890. The family that had fled Baghdad as refugees was now integrated into British aristocracy. This alliance served mutual interests perfectly. The British government needed someone to manage the messy business of opium distribution without direct government fingerprints. The Sassoons needed British military and legal protection to operate in China. Together, they created plausible deniability. The British could claim they weren't directly dealing drugs, while ensuring their merchants had navy protection and legal backing. Look at how this worked during the Second Opium War, 1856-1860. British and French forces attacked China to force further trade concessions. The stated justification was Chinese violations of treaty terms. The actual motivation was expanding opium access. Sassoon and Company didn't fight the war, but they were its primary beneficiaries. When the Treaty of Tientsin opened 11 new ports to foreign trade and legalized opium, Sassoon warehouses appeared in every new port within months. The British Navy was essentially providing military security for Sassoon commercial expansion. This wasn't unusual. European imperial powers routinely used military force to advance merchant interests, but the scale was unprecedented. An entire nation was being forced to accept drug imports to enrich a handful of families, with one family taking the majority of profits. The alliance extended beyond military protection. British courts in treaty ports consistently ruled in favor of Sassoon interests. When Chinese merchants defaulted on opium loans, British judges enforced Sassoon collection claims. When Chinese officials tried to restrict opium sales, British diplomats intervened citing treaty rights. The Sassoons had the full weight of British imperial law backing their operations. In return, the Sassoons made themselves useful to British policy goals. They provided intelligence about Chinese markets and political developments. They financed infrastructure projects the British government wanted but couldn't fund directly. They employed thousands of Indians in ways that supported British economic extraction while providing enough jobs to prevent unrest. What's interesting is how completely this alliance corrupted British policy toward China. By 1870, British strategic interests in Asia were thoroughly entangled with opium revenue. Government officials received salaries partially funded by opium taxes. British India's budget depended on opium auction proceeds. Naval deployments were justified by protecting merchant shipping, predominantly opium cargo. This created a situation where British policy couldn't oppose opium trade without undermining imperial finances. Reformers in Parliament occasionally proposed restricting opium exports. They were consistently defeated by arguments that India's budget would collapse, Chinese markets would close to British goods, and Britain's Asian empire would become unprofitable. The Sassoons understood this dynamic perfectly. They didn't need to bribe officials directly, though they certainly cultivated relationships through loans and favors. They just needed to make themselves systemically important. Once British imperial finances depended on Sassoon operations, criticizing the Sassoons meant criticizing the empire's economic foundation. This is how you build power that transcends mere wealth. The Rothschilds were rich, but European governments could function without them. The Sassoons engineered a situation where British India and British China policy couldn't function without Sassoon commercial infrastructure. They'd made themselves indispensable. David Sassoon died in 1864. legendary in Bombay, largely unknown in Britain. His sons inherited not just wealth, but this carefully constructed alliance. By 1880, the Sassoon Empire employed 20,000 people across Asia. They'd expanded beyond opium into cotton mills, real estate, banking, and shipping. But opium remained the foundation, still 60–70% of total profits. The second-generation Sassoons, Albert, Elias, Solomon, Reuben, were British gentlemen who happened to be Jewish, not Jewish merchants who happened to work with the British. They thought in terms of empire, not just business. They saw themselves as partners with British power, not subordinates. This confidence would shape their next moves. With British backing secured, with monopoly position established, with social legitimacy achieved, the Sassoons would push for total market dominance, not just in opium, but across every sector of Asian commerce. They would try to become the commercial infrastructure of the British Empire in Asia. But absolute dominance creates absolute vulnerability. The bigger the empire, the more points of failure. And within the family, the third generation was coming of age with questions their grandfather never entertained. Was this wealth worth the moral cost? Could Jewish values coexist with drug empire profits? Should they transition away from opium before Chinese resistance grew too strong? Those questions would fracture the dynasty in ways no external competitor ever could. Chapter 5. Total dominance between 1875 and 1895. The Sassoons achieved something unprecedented in commercial history. They controlled the majority of trade between British India and China, while simultaneously dominating real estate in Asia as three most important commercial cities, Bombay, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. They were, in effect, the economic infrastructure connecting the world's two most populous nations. The numbers from this period are staggering. Sassoon and Company's annual revenue by 1890 exceeded £50 million sterling, equivalent to roughly $7 billion today. Their opium operations alone moved 4,000–5,000 tons annually. Their cotton mills in Bombay employed 15,000 workers. Their Shanghai real estate holdings included over 1,800 properties. They owned the Cathay Hotel, Shanghai's most luxurious establishment. They controlled Sassoon Banking Company, with branches in 7 countries. But total dominance required more than just size. It required eliminating competition, controlling supply chains absolutely, and making yourself irreplaceable to government policy. The Sassoons executed all 3 strategies simultaneously. Eliminating competition started with price wars. When Jardine Matheson or Denton Company tried to undercut Sassoon opium prices, the Sassoons would temporarily slash prices below cost, using profits from cotton mills and real estate to sustain losses. Smaller competitors couldn't survive extended price wars. They'd exhaust capital and sell their operations, usually to the Sassoons. Between 1875 and 1890, Sassoon and Company absorbed 6 major competitors this way. The strategy worked because the Sassoons had diversified revenue streams, while competitors remained dependent on trading profits. This is the value of vertical integration. Your opium division can lose money for 6 months if your cotton division and real estate holdings generate enough profit to cover losses. Competitors operating only in trade couldn't match this resilience. Control of supply chains meant owning every link from Indian opium fields to Chinese consumer markets. By 1890, the Sassoons had achieved this completely. They had exclusive contracts with opium growers in central India, paying above market prices for guaranteed supply. They owned processing facilities that converted raw opium into smokable form. They owned ships that transported it. They owned warehouses that stored it. They owned banking services that financed purchases. They employed Chinese distribution networks that delivered it to inland provinces. At every stage, they extracted profit. This is how you turn a commodity with 200% markup into a business with 400% total profit. You don't just sell the product, you charge for every service surrounding the product. Shipping fees, storage fees, banking fees, insurance fees. The actual opium was almost incidental to the ecosystem of charges they'd built around it. Making themselves irreplaceable to British policy was subtler but equally important. By 1885, opium revenue provided 16% of British India's government income, approximately £8 million annually. The Sassoons generated roughly 60% of that revenue. Simple math. £5 million of government income depended on Sassoon operations. That's enough to fund the Indian Army's operations in Burma, Afghanistan border security, and administrative salaries for hundreds of British officials. What happens if you threaten Sassoon business? You threaten British imperial administration funding. This made the Sassoons effectively untouchable by British reformers. There were growing anti-opium movements in Britain by the Retry A Continue. Edit 1880s. Missionary groups documenting Chinese addiction. Moral crusaders arguing drug trade contradicted Christian values. Politicians questioning whether empire should fund itself through narcotics. The Sassoons neutralized these threats through strategic lobbying. They funded studies proving opium was no more harmful than alcohol. They published pamphlets arguing that restricting opium would damage British workers employed in Indian opium processing. They reminded members of parliament that Indian tax revenue funded British military supremacy in Asia. Every anti-opium proposal faced coordinated Sassoon opposition, backed by Treasury officials who didn't want budget shortfalls. This wasn't just about protecting opium profits, it was about protecting the entire Sassoon position in Asian commerce. If British policy turned against opium, the Sassoons would lose their core business, yes, but also their leverage, their banking relationships, their shipping contracts, their real estate influence. All of it was amplified by opium dominance. Take away opium, and they'd become just another large merchant house instead of an indispensable economic infrastructure. So they fought viciously. When the 1891 Royal Commission on Opium investigated the trade, the Sassoons submitted extensive testimony arguing opium prohibition would devastate India's economy and force massive tax increases on British citizens. They positioned themselves as defenders of British taxpayers against well-meaning but economically naive reformers. The Commission ultimately recommended continuing the opium trade with minor regulations. The Sassoons had won, but total dominance created internal tensions. The third generation of Sassoons, David's grandchildren, were born into wealth, educated at Oxford and Cambridge, fully assimilated into British society. They didn't remember Baghdad. They didn't remember refugee desperation. They'd never been excluded from clubs or faced discrimination. They were British aristocrats who happened to have Jewish ancestry and happened to inherit a drug empire. This generation started asking uncomfortable questions. Jacob Sassoon, Albert's son, repeatedly suggested the family should transition away from opium toward legitimate business. He argued that chemical addiction was morally indefensible regardless of legal status. He pointed out that British social attitudes were shifting. Opium merchants were becoming less respectable, not more. He warned that Chinese resentment could eventually explode into violence targeting foreign merchants. His warnings were ignored by older family members still running operations. Albert Sassoon, now in his 60s, had spent his entire career building the opium empire. He wasn't going to dismantle it because his son developed moral qualms. Elias and Solomon felt the same way. The opium business worked. It generated massive profits with acceptable risk. Why change? This generational divide was deepening. The second generation saw business as family duty. You inherited the enterprise. You expanded it. You passed it to your children. The third generation saw business as a choice. You could pursue different industries, different values, different legacies. They had enough inherited wealth to not need opium profits. They could afford to be moral. Meanwhile, in China, resistance was building. Not just government resistance, the Qing dynasty had essentially given up fighting opium by the 1880s, but popular resistance. Chinese intellectuals were publishing treatises blaming opium addiction for China's weakness. Nationalist movements were identifying foreign drug merchants as primary enemies of Chinese civilization. Violence against foreign businesses was increasing. The Sassoons employed security forces at every facility. Armed guards protected warehouses. Compradors who'd worked with the family for decades were assassinated by anti-foreign groups. Sassoon ships faced piracy attempts specifically targeting opium cargo. The costs of maintaining dominance were rising, yet profits remained enormous enough to justify the risks. A single opium shipment, 500 chests from Bombay to Shanghai, generated $30,000 profit. The Sassoons were doing dozens of these shipments monthly. Even with increased security costs, even with occasional cargo losses, even with growing political instability, the business was printing money. This is the seduction of total dominance. Once you've built the infrastructure, once you've eliminated competitors, once you've captured regulatory protection, the money flows almost automatically. You're not hustling for deals, you're managing a machine that converts political protection and market control into wealth. By 1895, the Sassoons were so dominant that Sassoon had become synonymous with opium in China. Chinese merchants didn't say, "I need to buy drugs." They said, "I need to see the Sassoons." The family name appeared on buildings across Shanghai. Sassoon Road, Sassoon House, Sassoon Docks. They'd literally written themselves into the urban landscape. But empires built on single commodities face inherent vulnerability. The Sassoons had diversified into cotton, real estate, and banking, but opium still generated 60% of profits. What happens when that commodity faces political threats? What happens when the British government changes its mind? What happens when Chinese nationalism grows strong enough to challenge foreign dominance? The Sassoons in 1895 believed they'd built something permanent. They owned the infrastructure. They had British protection. They'd survived every previous challenge. Total dominance felt secure. They were wrong. The next 40 years would bring revolution, war, nationalism, and the complete restructuring of Asian geopolitics. The Opium Empire would survive longer than you'd expect, testimony to how deeply embedded it was, but it would ultimately collapse. And when it did, the family would fracture, the wealth would disperse, and the name Sassoon would fade from prominence so completely that most people today have never heard of them. The empire was at its peak, which meant the decline was about to begin. Chapter 6: Family Fracture. The split happened in 1897, and it was both sudden and inevitable. David Sassoon's grandson, also named David, announced he was establishing a separate firm, E.D. Sassoon and Company, independent from the main family business. This wasn't a gentle divergence. This was a fracture that would split the Sassoon empire into competing factions and accelerate its eventual decline. You need to understand what this meant structurally. For 65 years, the Sassoons had operated as a unified family enterprise. All profits flowed to a central entity. All strategic decisions came from family consensus. All external negotiations presented a united front. This unity was their competitive advantage. Rivals faced not just a business, but a dynasty. The younger David Sassoon wanted out. Not out of commerce, he was launching his own trading house, but out from under the older generation's control. His reasoning was straightforward. The family business was too conservative, too focused on opium, too unwilling to embrace new opportunities in modern industry and finance. He saw the future in manufacturing, electric power, and modern banking, not in a drug trade facing growing international criticism. The older generation saw betrayal. Albert Sassoon, the patriarch after David Sr.'s death, viewed the family business as sacred trust. You didn't abandon it for personal ambition. You didn't split the empire because you had different strategic preferences. You subordinated individual desires to family interests. The conflict went deeper than business strategy. It was about identity. The second generation still identified primarily as merchants, wealthy, yes, but fundamentally traders operating in markets. The third generation identified as British aristocrats who happened to own businesses. They wanted respectability more than they wanted profits. They wanted their children to marry into British nobility, attend the right schools, join the right clubs. Opium wealth was becoming a liability to these ambitions. British social attitudes were shifting. The 1890s saw growing temperance movements, anti-drug campaigns, and religious organizations condemning the opium trade. Queen Victoria herself was reportedly uncomfortable with opium profits, though she never directly opposed the trade. The missionary movement was documenting Chinese suffering in ways that made opium merchants look like villains rather than respectable businessmen. David the Younger recognized this trend earlier than his relatives. He understood that the moral ground was shifting. What had been acceptable in 1870, building fortunes on Chinese addiction, was becoming scandalous by 1900. He wanted to separate himself from that legacy, before it destroyed the family's social position. So he took roughly 1/3 of the family's capital, approximately $5 million, and established E.D. Sassoon and Company. His firm would focus on modern industries, cotton mills using advanced machinery, electric utilities, chemical manufacturing, and banking services for legitimate trade. He explicitly avoided opium. The main Sassoon firm, now controlled by Albert and his brothers, continued the traditional business. Opium remained their core profit generator. They argued, not without merit, that British India's economy still depended on opium revenue. They pointed out that Chinese demand hadn't decreased. If anything, addiction rates were still climbing. They insisted moral objections were naive. Business operated in the real world, not in ethical fantasies. Both factions had valid arguments. The traditionalists were right that opium remained profitable and that alternative revenue sources couldn't match opium margins. The reformists were right that political risks were increasing and that future generations would judge opium wealth harshly. The fracture weakened both sides. Competitors who'd been unable to challenge unified Sassoon dominance now found opportunities. Jardine Matheson, always the Sassoons' primary rival, began capturing market share in Shanghai. New players entered opium trade, seeing the Sassoons split as evidence of vulnerability. British banks that had deferred to Sassoon financial power started competing more aggressively. What's interesting is how the split reflected larger tensions in European Jewish communities. Across Europe, wealthy Jewish families faced the same question. How much do you assimilate versus maintaining distinct identity? The Rothschilds maintained Jewish identity while achieving economic power. The Sassoons tried to become British aristocrats who happened to be Jewish. This created internal contradictions that weakened family cohesion. The third generation largely sided with David the Younger. They wanted modern, respectable businesses. They wanted clean wealth that didn't require defending opium trade at dinner parties. They wanted to marry British aristocrats without facing whispers about drug money. The second generation viewed this as weakness. They'd fled persecution in Baghdad, built an empire through ruthlessness and intelligence, and now their grandchildren were embarrassed by the source of their wealth. This was contemptible. The whole point of generational wealth was that future generations could pursue whatever they wanted because the foundation was secure. Instead, the third generation was undermining that foundation through moral posturing. Family gatherings became battlegrounds. The London Sassoons, mostly third generation, avoided the Bombay Sassoons, still running traditional operations. Marriages that might have unified the branches did not happen. Third-generation Sassoons increasingly married into British nobility rather than within the extended family. The network of cousins and siblings that had made Sassoon enterprises so effective was dissolving. By 1905, there were effectively 3 Sassoon entities: the original Sassoon and Company in Bombay and Shanghai, still opium-focused, E.D. Sassoon and Company, modern industries, and the London Sassoons, banking and real estate. They competed more than they cooperated. They stopped sharing commercial intelligence. They bid against each other for business opportunities. This fragmentation was devastating. The Sassoons' competitive advantage had always been unity, fast decision-making, shared resources, family loyalty transcending individual profit. Once that dissolved, they were just 3 medium-sized firms competing in crowded markets. External factors accelerated the fracture. Chinese nationalism was growing. The 1911 revolution overthrew the Qing dynasty, and the new Republican government was explicitly anti-opium. They couldn't ban foreign trade due to treaty obligations, but they could make life difficult for opium merchants. They imposed new taxes, increased inspections, and encouraged anti-foreign violence. Meanwhile, the British government was finally moving against opium. The 1909 International Opium Commission in Shanghai, ironic location, began pushing for restrictions. Britain agreed to gradually reduce opium exports to China. This wasn't primarily moral concern, it was geopolitical calculation. Britain wanted to maintain influence in China without the liability of drug trade propping up unpopular regimes. The Sassoon traditionalists fought these policies desperately. They argued that India's budget would collapse. They warned of economic crisis. They predicted disaster, and they were partially right. Opium revenue was 15% of British India's income. Removing it meant finding alternative taxation or cutting spending, but British policy shifted anyway. The combination of international pressure, Chinese nationalism, and changing British moral attitudes overcame Sassoon lobbying. By 1913, Britain had committed to phasing out opium exports over 10 years. The Sassoons' core business had an expiration date. This vindicated David the Younger's strategy. E.D. Sassoon and Company, already diversified into modern industries, barely felt the impact. The traditional Sassoon firms faced catastrophic revenue losses. They scrambled to shift operations toward cotton, shipping, and real estate, but they were decades behind competitors who'd never relied on opium. The family fracture that had seemed like internal drama in 1897 now looked like prescient business strategy. The reformist branch had positioned itself for the 20th century. The traditionalist branch was shackled to a dying 19th century business model. But here's the cruel irony. Both branches would ultimately fail. E.D. Sassoon and Company would survive longer, but it would never match the dominance of the unified family empire. The traditional branches would decline rapidly, and all of them would face a threat they hadn't anticipated: the total collapse of the British Empire in Asia that had protected their operations for a century. The fracture had weakened them. The coming wars would destroy them. Chapter 7. War's End. World War I barely touched the Sassoons financially. They profited from war logistics and commodity speculation, but it shattered the geopolitical foundation their empire depended on. The British Empire emerged from WWI financially exhausted, morally questioned, and facing independence movements across Asia. The absolute British dominance that had protected Sassoon operations since the 1840s was ending. The opium phase-out accelerated during the war. By 1917, British India had stopped auctioning opium to merchants. The trade that had generated billions in today's money, that had funded the Sassoon Empire, that had addicted millions of Chinese, was officially over. The Sassoons had known it was coming, but the speed still shocked them. Traditional Sassoon and Company in Bombay collapsed first. Without opium revenue, they couldn't maintain operations. Their cotton mills faced competition from Japanese manufacturers. Their shipping business struggled against modern steamship companies. Their real estate holdings in Bombay remained valuable, but generated income, not the explosive growth they'd experienced during opium decades. By 1920, the original Sassoon firm was effectively defunct, absorbed into other companies or liquidated. E.D. Sassoon and Company, the reformist branch, survived but transformed. They'd pivoted successfully to modern industries: cotton manufacturing, utilities, banking. They had major operations in Shanghai, where they'd built the Cathay Hotel, now the Peace Hotel, still standing, and owned significant real estate. They seemed positioned for continued success. Then came 1930s China, Japanese expansion into Manchuria in 1931, full-scale war by 1937, and the occupation of Shanghai in 1941 devastated Sassoon operations. Victor Sassoon, David the Younger's son, ran E.D. Sassoon and Company by this point. He watched helplessly as Japanese forces seized Sassoon properties, confiscated assets, and expelled foreign merchants. Victor was shrewd. He'd diversified into property holdings outside China, particularly in Bombay and London. But the Shanghai operations had been the core of E.D. Sassoon's business. Losing Shanghai meant losing roughly 60% of the firm's asset value. Millions of pounds in real estate, hundreds of properties, decades of built relationships, all gone. The Chinese Revolution of 1949 delivered the final blow. When the communists took power, they nationalized all foreign assets. The Sassoons lost everything remaining in China. Properties worth tens of millions of pounds were seized without compensation. The Cathay Hotel, the crown jewel of Sassoon Shanghai investments, was confiscated and renamed. Sassoon House, their headquarters building, was taken over by the new government. Think about what this meant. The Sassoons had operated in China for over 100 years. They'd built infrastructure, cultivated relationships, owned properties in every major city. They'd literally shaped Shanghai's development. Neighborhoods existed because Sassoon capital had funded construction. And in a single year, it was all erased. The communist government didn't care about historical claims or international law. Foreign merchants who'd exploited China during the century of humiliation were enemies, and their property was forfeit. Victor Sassoon left China in 1948, just before the revolution completed. He relocated operations to the Bahamas, trying to preserve remaining capital. E.D. Sassoon and Company continued as an investment firm, managing dispersed assets. But the glory days were finished. The company that had employed tens of thousands now had a small office staff managing portfolios. The London Sassoons fared better but differently. They'd married into British aristocracy. The Rothschilds, the Cholmondeleys, other noble families. They'd become British aristocrats with distant commercial ancestors. They had country estates, titles, and social position. But they weren't merchants anymore. They were landed gentry, living off inherited wealth and social connections. By 1960, there was no unified Sassoon commercial empire. E.D. Sassoon and Company existed on paper, but not as a significant economic force. The original Sassoon and Company had disappeared entirely. The family wealth was distributed among descendants living across Britain, the Bahamas, and India, with no central coordination. What's remarkable is how completely they vanished from prominence. The Rothschilds remain famous. Everyone knows the name, whether or not they know the details. The Sassoons are footnotes. Ask people about 19th century British merchant dynasties, and they'll mention the East India Company. They might remember Jardine Matheson. Almost nobody mentions the Sassoons. This erasure was partly intentional. The family never wanted to be known primarily for opium wealth. After opium trade ended, they had no interest in preserving that legacy. They didn't write memoirs highlighting drug profits. They didn't establish museums celebrating their commercial dominance. They quietly transitioned into British aristocracy and hoped the Opium Association would be forgotten. China actively wanted to forget them too. The communist government preferred narratives about Chinese resistance to foreign exploitation over detailed accounts of which specific families did the exploiting. Sassoon buildings were repurposed without historical markers. The name was allowed to fade. The British had reasons to let the story disappear as well. Opium trade was an embarrassing chapter in imperial history. The idea that the British Empire had fought wars to force China to accept drug imports, that British government revenue had depended on narcotics taxation, that British merchants had deliberately addicted millions of Chinese, none of this fit comfortable narratives about empire bringing civilization and progress. So the Sassoons faded from collective memory. Their buildings remain. You can still see Sassoon architecture in Mumbai and Shanghai, but most people don't know who built them. Their wealth dissolved across multiple generations and continents. Their name means nothing to most people, despite having been among the most powerful economic forces in 19th century Asia. The empire that had controlled 70% of opium flowing into China, that had employed 20,000 people across a dozen cities, that had financed the development of modern Shanghai and Mumbai, simply vanished from historical consciousness. Not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet dispersal and deliberate forgetting. 2 world wars, decolonization, communist revolution, and changing moral attitudes had erased what refugee determination and ruthless business strategy had built. The Rothschilds of the East disappeared so completely that calling them the Rothschilds of the East now requires extensive explanation, because nobody knows who you're talking about. Chapter 8. Forgotten Legacy. Walk through Mumbai's Kala Ghoda district today and count Sassoon landmarks. Sassoon Library, built 1870. Sassoon Docks, completed 1875, still the city's primary fish market. David Sassoon Clock Tower, standing since 1865. Jacob Sassoon School. Ali Kadori School, funded by Sassoon relatives. You're surrounded by Sassoon architecture. Ask locals who Sassoon was. Maybe 1 in 50 knows. Most assume it's just a street name, an old building title, no different from generic British colonial infrastructure. The family that shaped Mumbai's development, that employed tens of thousands of Indian workers, that funded institutions still serving millions, has been almost completely forgotten in their adopted city. Shanghai is worse. The Peace Hotel, formerly the Cathay Hotel, is a tourist landmark. Travel guides mention it was built by a wealthy merchant family, without naming the Sassoons. Sassoon House, their headquarters building, is occupied by government offices and retail. There's a small historical plaque, noting foreign ownership in the 19th century. That's it. Nothing about the family that arguably built more of Shanghai's commercial infrastructure than any other single entity. This amnesia isn't accidental. It's the result of three converging forces: family preference, Chinese nationalism, and British imperial embarrassment. Each group had reasons to forget, and together they erased one of the most significant merchant dynasties in modern history. The family wanted opium wealth forgotten for obvious reasons. By the 1960s, third and fourth generation Sassoons were British aristocrats, socialites, and minor nobility. They had no desire to be associated with drug trafficking. They didn't establish historical societies or publish family archives. They dispersed geographically. Some remained in Britain, some moved to the Bahamas, some settled in Israel after its founding in 1948. The network fragmented, and with it, collective memory. Victor Sassoon, the last major Sassoon businessman, died in 1961. His obituary in the Times focused on his philanthropy and World War II service, mentioning opium trade only in passing as controversial 19th century family business. His estate was dispersed among various heirs and charitable foundations. There was no effort to preserve Sassoon commercial history or create a legacy narrative. Chinese nationalism required forgetting specific foreign merchant families. Communist historiography preferred broad narratives about foreign imperialism rather than detailed accounts of individual families. Naming the Sassoons specifically would mean explaining how they'd operated, which would require acknowledging Chinese comprador collaboration, Qing dynasty corruption, and the complexity of semi-colonial economics. Far simpler to discuss foreign exploitation generally without naming names. British historians had similar motivations. Detailed Sassoon histories require explaining how the British Empire fought 2 wars to force China to accept opium imports, how British India's budget depended on drug revenue, how British courts enforced opium loan collections. This contradicts preferred narratives about empire-spreading civilization, rule of law, and economic development. Easier to let the story fade, but here's what's being forgotten, and it's not just opium. The Sassoons pioneered modern global supply chain management. They understood vertical integration before the term existed. They recognized that controlling infrastructure, ships, warehouses, banks, mattered more than controlling products. They saw that political relationships determined commercial success. These insights were genuinely innovative, and they shaped how modern multinational corporations operate. They also pioneered what we'd now call corporate social responsibility, though with problematic motivations. David Sassoon's philanthropy wasn't just generosity, it was strategic reputation management. Build hospitals and libraries, and people focus on that rather than how you made money. Modern corporations do exactly this, fund visible good works while pursuing profit maximization, sometimes in ethically questionable domains. The Sassoon story reveals uncomfortable truths about wealth creation. Generational fortunes often originate in morally compromised industries. The difference between 19th century opium merchants and modern wealth is primarily time and historical amnesia. Wait long enough and origins don't matter. The Sassoons didn't get enough time before geopolitical upheaval erased their empire, so their wealth never fully laundered through generational distance. Consider the parallel. Sassoon opium wealth funded libraries and schools across India and China. Those institutions provided real benefits: education, healthcare, public resources. Does the good they enabled outweigh the addiction, death, and societal destruction that funded them? There's no easy answer. Millions of Indians benefited from Sassoon institutions, while millions of Chinese suffered from Sassoon opium. How do you weigh those against each other? Modern Mumbai still uses Sassoon docks daily. Thousands of fishermen work there. The infrastructure remains useful 150 years later. Would Mumbai have been better off if David Sassoon had never built it? Probably not. Someone else would have built docks, possibly worse ones. Does that absolve the funding source? That's harder to answer. The same complexity applies to Shanghai. Sassoon capital built neighborhoods, established banks, funded early industrialization. Modern Shanghai inherited that infrastructure. The communist government didn't demolish Sassoon buildings. They repurposed them because they were valuable. The city's development was shaped by Sassoon investment, even if the name is now forgotten. Here's the philosophical problem. Can infrastructure built with immoral wealth be considered neutral after enough time passes? The Sassoons are gone. The opium addicts they supplied are dead. The British Empire that protected them has dissolved. But the buildings remain, serving purposes their creators never intended, benefiting people who've never heard of the family that built them. Maybe that's the real Sassoon legacy, not opium profits or commercial dominance, but accidental urban development. They wanted to build a permanent trading empire. They actually built permanent physical infrastructure that outlasted their commercial relevance. The Peace Hotel remains profitable 80 years after Victor Sassoon sold it. Sassoon docks still serve Mumbai's fishing industry 150 years after construction. The institutions survive while the dynasty has been forgotten. There's irony in that. The Sassoons desperately wanted to be remembered as great merchants, as the Jewish Rothschilds of Asia, as builders of empire. Instead, they're remembered, when they're remembered at all, as controversial opium dealers whose buildings happen to still be useful. The final question is whether they should be remembered. Chinese historians argue yes. Forgetting the Sassoons means forgetting the mechanisms of semi-colonial exploitation. Understanding how foreign merchants operated helps explain how China was subjugated economically, even when not fully colonized. The Sassoons are educational examples of commercial imperialism. Indian historians are more ambivalent. The Sassoons were foreigners who extracted wealth from Asia, but they also employed Indians, funded infrastructure, and contributed to Mumbai's development. They were neither pure villains nor pure benefactors. They were complex actors in a complex period. British historians largely ignore them. There are no major Sassoon biographies in English in the last 30 years. Academic interest is minimal. They don't fit comfortable narratives about either imperial success or imperial exploitation. They're anomalous. A Jewish merchant family that became British aristocrats while operating primarily in Asia, making fortunes in drugs while funding libraries, dominating trade networks while remaining relatively unknown to general British public. So they've been forgotten, and maybe that's appropriate. They built an empire on human suffering. They transitioned that wealth into institutional philanthropy. They created infrastructure that outlasted their relevance. They vanished from history so completely that most people have never heard of them. Whether that's justice, tragedy, or just historical contingency is impossible to say. What remains are buildings in Mumbai and Shanghai, used daily by people who don't know who built them. Library books shelved in institutions bearing a name that means nothing to borrowers. Docks where fish are sold by merchants who've never heard of David Sassoon. Infrastructure without memory. Wealth without legacy. An empire so thoroughly forgotten that calling them the Rothschilds of the East requires explaining both who the Rothschilds were and who the Sassoons were that covered the ultimate irony. They wanted immortal fame and achieved perfect anonymity. There's one more layer to this. Forgetting that deserves examination. The role of academic. Gatekeeping in determining which histories get told and which get buried. The Sassoon story sits in an uncomfortable intersection between multiple academic disciplines, and none of them want to fully claim it. Economic historians study the British Empire's commercial networks, but they focus on institutions like the East India Company, rather than individual merchant families. The Sassoons are too specific, too Jewish, too morally complicated for narratives about imperial trade driving modernization. Including them means discussing how addiction economics fueled British India's budget, which complicates clean stories about capitalism and development. Jewish historians focus on persecution, resistance, and cultural preservation. The Sassoons don't fit comfortably into these narratives. They weren't victims. They were extraordinarily successful exploiters who happened to be Jewish. They don't represent Jewish suffering or Jewish resistance to oppression. They represent Jewish collaboration with imperial power to extract wealth from Asian populations. That's not a story that serves contemporary Jewish identity narratives. Chinese historians have their own reasons for simplified narratives. The communist historiography prefers discussing broad forces, imperialism, colonialism, feudal corruption, rather than specific merchant families. Naming the Sassoons requires explaining the complex web of Chinese comprador collaboration, regional variations in opium distribution, and the ways Chinese merchants profited from the trade. alongside foreign merchants. Much easier to discuss foreign opium merchants generically than to detail how the system actually functioned. Indian historians face similar complexity. The Sassoons employed thousands of Indians, funded major infrastructure still in use, and contributed to Bombay's development into a modern city. They were also extracting wealth from India to fund Chinese drug distribution. They were simultaneously exploiters and builders. This moral ambiguity doesn't serve nationalist narratives about colonial extraction or stories about Indian victimization. So the Sassoons fall through disciplinary cracks. They're too complicated for any single academic narrative, too morally ambiguous for comfortable conclusions, too Jewish for imperial history, too successful for Jewish history, too foreign for Chinese history, too associated with British power for Indian history. What remains in scholarship are specialized studies, a few academic books, some journal articles, occasional mentions in broader works about the opium trade or British India. These exist in academic libraries, inaccessible to general readers, written in scholarly language that obscures as much as it reveals. Popular history almost completely ignores them. There are thousands of books about the Rothschilds, dozens about other prominent Jewish families, countless works on British merchant empires. The Sassoons get maybe 2 or 3 popular history books in the last 50 years, none of which achieved significant readership. This academic marginalization ensures continued public forgetting. Without scholarly attention driving popular interest, without documentaries or mainstream books bringing the story to wider audiences, the Sassoons remain obscure. Most people will never encounter their story unless they specifically research 19th century Asian commerce or opium trades. History. Compare this to how the Rothschilds have been remembered. Dozens of biographies, conspiracy theories, cultural references, name recognition across the world. The Rothschilds are remembered, often incorrectly, often through anti-Semitic mythology, but remembered nonetheless, while the Sassoons are forgotten. This isn't because the Rothschilds were more important or more powerful. It's because their story fits more comfortably into existing narratives about Jewish finance, European power, and dynastic wealth. The Sassoon story doesn't fit anywhere comfortably, so it doesn't get told. And when it's not told, it gets forgotten. And when it's forgotten, the buildings they built stand nameless. The institutions they funded operate without acknowledgement of origins, and the wealth they created circulates through descendant families who themselves often don't know the full story of how it was made. This is how history actually gets erased, not through dramatic suppression or censorship, but through academic disinterest, narrative incompatibility, and the quiet choice to focus on simpler stories that serve contemporary purposes better than complicated truths. Chapter 9. The Women Behind the Empire. Every Sassoon history focuses on David, Albert, Elias, and Victor, the patriarchs, the businessmen, the empire builders. What gets erased almost completely is the women who made that empire function. Not through direct commercial control, but through something more fundamental. They held the family together when business threatened to tear it apart. They managed the social networks that gave Sassoons access to British power, and they made decisions about wealth distribution that determined which branches survived and which collapsed. This erasure wasn't accidental. Victorian business culture didn't acknowledge women's economic roles. Sassoon business records list male partners, male employees, male agents. Women appear only as wives and daughters, legal dependents with no commercial standing. But look closer at the actual family operations, and you'll see women everywhere, managing households that employed hundreds, controlling trust funds worth millions, arranging marriages that determined business alliances, and making investment decisions that shaped family wealth for generations. Start with Flora Sassoon, David's wife. She arrived in Bombay in 1832 with 8 children, pregnant with a 9th, leaving behind her entire extended family in Baghdad. The standard narrative treats her as supportive spouse. She managed the household while David built the business. That's technically true, but meaninglessly incomplete. Flora ran a household that was itself a business operation. The Sassoon mansion in Bombay employed 150 people by the 1850s. Cooks, servants, groundskeepers, security, clerks, religious staff. Managing that workforce required sophisticated organizational skills: scheduling, payroll, conflict resolution, quality control, supplier relationships. Flora wasn't just decorating rooms. She was running what amounted to a small hotel and corporate headquarters combined. She also managed the family's religious and social identity. David wanted to be seen as a pious Jewish patriarch, which required maintaining kosher kitchens, observing Sabbath, hosting religious scholars, funding synagogue operations. Flora made that happen. She organized Sabbath dinners for 50 people weekly. She ensured dietary laws were followed across a household serving Indian, Middle Eastern, and British cuisines. She managed relationships with Mumbai's Jewish community, which was crucial for David's reputation. Here's what most historians miss. Flora controlled access to David. Anyone wanting to do business with Sassoon and Company had to get through his household first. Flora decided who got dinner invitations, who was welcomed as a guest, who could meet David socially versus only professionally. This gatekeeping power was enormous. British officials who wanted Sassoon cooperation cultivated relationships with Flora. Merchants seeking deals knew Flora's approval helped. She also managed information flows. David traveled constantly between Bombay, Calcutta, and eventually China. Flora stayed in Bombay, running the household and raising children. She maintained correspondence networks with family members across Asia. She received letters from Albert in Canton, from Elias in Shanghai, from various cousins and relatives scattered across the empire. She consolidated this information and determined what David needed to know immediately versus what could wait. This made her a central intelligence node in Sassoon operations. She knew which relatives were competent, which were struggling, which could be trusted with major responsibilities. David made final decisions, but Flora shaped the information environment those decisions were based on. Then there's the succession question. David and Flora had 8 sons who survived to adulthood, an enormous number for any family, but particularly significant for a business dynasty. Who got which roles? Who inherited what? Who was prepared for leadership? These decisions were made jointly by David and Flora's assessments mattered enormously. She advocated for Elias when David was skeptical about sending him to Shanghai. She recognized that Albert had the diplomatic skills for London operations before David did. She identified which sons had commercial talent versus which should focus on religious scholarship or community leadership. David listened because Flora had spent more time with the children, had better insight into their personalities and capabilities. When Flora died in 1886, the family's cohesion immediately weakened. She'd been the person everyone trusted to be fair, to put family interests above individual ambitions, to mediate disputes before they became fractures. Without her moderating influence, the brothers' rivalries intensified. The 1897 split that created E.D. Sassoon and Company happened partly because there was no Flora equivalent to hold the third generation together, move to the next generation, the wives of David's sons. These women faced different challenges. They were marrying into enormous wealth, not building it. They were often British or Anglo-Indian, not Middle Eastern Jewish. They navigated between 3 cultural spheres: traditional Jewish life, British imperial society, and Asian commercial reality. Louise Sassoon, Albert's wife, was crucial to the family's British integration. She was born in Britain, understood British social hierarchies intimately, and knew how to navigate aristocratic society. When Albert moved operations to London in 1858, Louise transformed the Sassoons from foreign merchants into British society fixtures. She hosted salons that mixed British nobility, political figures, and commercial leaders. She secured invitations to events that Jewish merchants typically couldn't access. She cultivated relationships with British aristocratic women, which opened doors their husbands controlled. She understood that in Victorian Britain, social acceptance often came through women's networks, afternoon teas, charity organizations, cultural patronage. Louise also managed something crucial. She made being Jewish fashionable rather than suspect. Victorian Britain was deeply Christian, often anti-Semitic. Jewish merchants faced social barriers despite their wealth. Louise positioned the Sassoons as exotic but civilized, Oriental enough to be interesting, British enough to be acceptable. She emphasized their ancient lineage, their scholarly traditions, their philanthropic commitments. She made British aristocrats curious about Jewish culture rather than hostile to it. This social engineering was sophisticated. She didn't hide Jewish identity. That would have been impossible and counterproductive. She reframed it as cultural richness. The Sassoons weren't foreign outsiders trying to infiltrate British society. They were bringing centuries of wisdom and tradition to enhance British civilization. This narrative worked because Louise understood her audience. She also controlled significant wealth independently. Albert established trust funds for Louise that gave her millions of pounds to manage. She invested in London real estate, in British government bonds, in commercial ventures. Her investment decisions were conservative. She prioritized preservation over growth, but that conservatism protected family wealth during turbulent periods when aggressive strategies would have resulted in losses. When Albert died in 1896, Louise became the primary guardian of Sassoon wealth in Britain. She decided which grandchildren got access to capital, which business ventures deserved family funding, which charitable causes aligned with Sassoon interests. She held this position until her death in 1913, effectively controlling the London branch of the family for 17 years. Then there's Rachel Sassoon Beer, one of the most remarkable and overlooked figures in the entire dynasty. Rachel married Edward Sassoon, one of David's sons, but she wasn't content being a wealthy merchant's wife. She bought and edited 2 London newspapers, The Observer and the Sunday Times, not as vanity projects but as serious journalistic enterprises. Think about what that meant in the 1890s. A Jewish woman controlling major British publications, setting editorial policy, making hiring decisions, shaping public opinion. This was unprecedented. Newspaper publishing was a male domain, often explicitly Christian in orientation. Rachel crashed through those barriers through sheer competence and strategic vision. She used The Observer to advocate for causes she cared about: women's suffrage, educational reform, anti-poverty programs. She also used it to protect Sassoon commercial interests. When anti-opium movements gained strength in the 1890s, The Observer published articles questioning prohibition effectiveness and emphasizing economic benefits of trade with China. Rachel never wrote these pieces herself. She hired journalists to make arguments that happened to align with family business interests. This was brilliant indirect influence. Rachel couldn't openly defend opium trade. That would have been scandalous for a woman in her social position. But she could control media narratives, shape public discourse, and create intellectual environments more favorable to Sassoon positions. She wielded cultural power that complemented the family's economic power. She also demonstrated that Sassoon women had ambitions beyond household management. Rachel wanted influence in her own right, not just reflected glory from her husband's business success. She pursued that through media ownership, becoming one of the most powerful women in British journalism. When she died in 1927, her obituaries focused on her newspaper career, barely mentioning that she was a Sassoon by marriage. The third generation produced even more complexity. These women were fully British, educated at elite schools, connected to aristocratic families through marriage. They faced the question, what does it mean to be a Sassoon woman when the empire is dissolving and the family name is becoming more liability than asset? Some chose complete assimilation. They married British aristocrats, converted to Christianity in some cases, distanced themselves from Jewish identity and commercial origins. They became British gentlewomen who happened to have inherited Sassoon wealth. Their children often didn't even know the details of how that wealth originated. Others tried to preserve Jewish identity while maintaining British social position. This required careful navigation. You could be Jewish if you were also cultured, sophisticated, philanthropic, and non-threatening. You couldn't be too Jewish. No thick accents, no obvious foreign customs, no commercial vulgarity. These women essentially performed a sanitized version of Jewish identity, palatable to British aristocracy. A few rejected both options. They became Zionists, supporting Jewish migration to Palestine, funding agricultural settlements, advocating for Jewish self-determination. They saw the Sassoon experience, successful integration followed by dissolution and forgetting, as evidence that diaspora Jewish life was inherently unstable. Better to build a Jewish homeland than to keep trying to fit into societies that would eventually reject you. These political divisions reflected deeper questions about Sassoon legacy. If you're a woman who inherited millions from opium wealth, what's your ethical responsibility? Some established charitable trusts focused on education and healthcare, trying to redirect tainted money toward good purposes. Others simply enjoyed the wealth without apparent moral qualms. A few actively researched family history and struggled with what they found. What's interesting is how invisible these women remained despite their power. Rachel Beer was probably the most publicly influential Sassoon of her generation, yet she's almost never mentioned in Sassoon histories. Louise Sassoon controlled more wealth than most contemporary British merchants, yet business histories don't discuss her investment strategies. Flora Sassoon held the family together for 50 years, yet she's a footnote in biographies of David. This invisibility was partly Victorian gender norms. Women's economic activities weren't recorded the same way as men's, but it was also strategic. Sassoon men wanted to be remembered as great merchants. Acknowledging that their wives and mothers were crucial to that success would have complicated that narrative. Easier to tell stories about visionary businessmen and ignore the domestic, social, and cultural labor that made their business success possible. The erasure continued into the 20th century. When Sassoon descendants wrote family memoirs, they focused on business deals and commercial triumphs. Women appeared as supportive background figures. Their actual decision-making power, their wealth control, their strategic importance, all of that was minimized or ignored. This creates a fundamental distortion in how we understand the Sassoon Empire. It wasn't just David and his sons building a commercial dynasty. It was David and Flora together, creating a family structure that could sustain business operations across continents. It was Albert and Louise together navigating British society and Chinese markets. It was multiple generations of women making decisions about wealth, marriage, identity, and legacy that determined which branches of the family survived. Consider what would have happened without these women. Without Flora's organizational skills, the Bombay household couldn't have functioned as business headquarters. Without Louise's social engineering, the Sassoons wouldn't have achieved British aristocratic acceptance. Without Rachel's media influence, anti-opium movements might have succeeded earlier. Without various third-generation women managing trust funds conservatively, family wealth would have dissipated faster. The empire wasn't built by men alone. It was built by partnerships, where women handled everything that didn't fit Victorian definitions of business, which meant they handled most of what actually made the business work. The household operations, the social networks, the cultural legitimacy, the succession planning, the wealth preservation, the identity management. And when the empire collapsed, women's decisions shaped what remained. Which grandchildren got education versus which got capital? Which properties to sell versus which to hold? Which charitable causes to support? Which family stories to preserve versus which to let fade? These weren't minor questions. They determined the shape of post-empire Sassoon life. By the 1960s, Sassoon descendants were scattered across 4 continents, living off inherited wealth managed mostly by women. The men who'd built the empire were dead. Their business ventures had dissolved. What remained was real estate, investment portfolios, and trust funds, all managed disproportionately by women who'd learned from mothers and grandmothers how to preserve wealth across generations. Those women ensured that even though the Sassoon name faded from commercial prominence, Sassoon descendants remained financially comfortable. They couldn't preserve the empire, but they preserved the wealth. They couldn't maintain the family's unified identity, but they ensured individual branches survived. This is a different kind of legacy than the commercial empire David built, but it's arguably more enduring. The opium business lasted 70 years. The cotton mills and trading houses dissolved within a century. But the wealth management strategies Sassoon women developed have kept descendants comfortable for 150 years. That's success measured differently than commercial dominance, but success nonetheless. The tragedy is that their names are forgotten even more thoroughly than their husbands' names. David Sassoon appears in specialist histories. Flora Sassoon doesn't. Albert Sassoon gets mentioned in accounts of British India trade. Louise Sassoon is invisible. Victor Sassoon has a Wikipedia page. The women who managed his family's wealth after his death don't. So when we talk about the Sassoon Empire, we're usually talking about half the story. The visible half, Business deals, opium shipments, commercial dominance. The invisible half, household management, social engineering, wealth preservation, identity navigation, gets erased despite being equally crucial to Sassoon's success and survival. This chapter exists to partially correct that erasure. Not completely. The historical record is too incomplete, too male-focused, too unconcerned with women's economic roles, but enough to recognize that the Rothschilds of the East weren't just David and his sons. They were David and Flora, Albert and Louise, Rachel Beer and her newspapers, and dozens of other women whose names we don't know but whose decisions shaped one of the 19th century's most powerful commercial dynasties. The empire was built by men and women together. It's remembered as if only men mattered. That's not historical accuracy. That's historical distortion reflecting Victorian gender biases we've inherited without questioning. The real Sassoon story includes the women who held empires together, while the men were busy building them, and who preserved wealth while the men were busy losing it. Chapter 10, the Opium Economies. Everyone knows the Sassoons sold opium. What almost nobody understands is how the actual business worked. The mechanics of moving 4,000 tons of drugs annually across thousands of miles, converting Indian crops into Chinese addiction, and transforming plant matter into generational wealth. The system was more sophisticated than most modern supply chains, and understanding it reveals why the Sassoons dominated so completely. Start with the product itself. Opium isn't cocaine or heroin. You don't just harvest and sell. Raw opium from poppy fields is useless for smoking. It requires processing, and that processing determined profit margins. The British East India Company controlled this process in India, but they didn't understand Chinese market preferences. The Sassoons did. Chinese opium smokers wanted specific consistency and purity. Too watery, and it wouldn't burn properly. Too thick, and it was harsh. The sweet spot required precise processing, heating raw opium to exact temperatures, mixing it with specific additives, aging it in particular conditions. The Sassoons invested heavily in processing facilities that could hit these specifications consistently. They built processing centers in Patna and Benares in India, employing chemists who understood opium preparation. These weren't crude operations. They were sophisticated chemical facilities, using temperature-controlled environments and quality testing. Each batch was graded, and only premium grades went to Shanghai and Canton, where prices were highest. Lower grades went to secondary markets or were reprocessed. This quality control gave the Sassoons pricing power. Chinese merchants knew Sassoon opium was reliable. You could buy cheaper opium from competitors, but consistency varied. The Sassoons charged 10–15% premiums because their product was standardized. In a market where your customers were addicts needing regular supply, consistency meant repeat business and customer loyalty. Now consider logistics. Moving 4,000 tons annually from India to China meant coordinating hundreds of shipments across monsoon seasons, piracy risks, and Chinese customs enforcement. The Sassoons didn't just own ships. They owned an entire logistics network optimized for drug smuggling, disguised as legal trade. Their ships followed carefully planned routes. Bombay to Canton took 35–40 days in good weather. The Sassoons scheduled departures to avoid monsoon season, but maximized Chinese market timing. Opium prices in China fluctuated based on supply. Prices rose in winter when shipping slowed, dropped in summer when shipments increased. The Sassoons timed arrivals to hit high price periods, using their fleet size to control supply timing. They also used ships strategically to gather intelligence. Every Sassoon captain was required to report market conditions in every port, current opium prices, competitor activities, enforcement actions, political developments. This information network meant the Sassoons always knew where to send next shipments for maximum profit. Competitors operating with chartered ships couldn't match this intelligence advantage. Piracy was a constant threat. The South China Sea in the 1860s was infested with pirates targeting opium ships specifically. The Sassoons armed their vessels and hired security forces, but they also did something cleverer. They bribed pirate leaders. Regular payments to major pirate organizations ensured Sassoon ships safe passage. This was cheaper than fighting constantly and created barriers for competitors who didn't have similar arrangements. When ships reached China, the real complexity began. Opium was technically illegal, so direct sales were impossible. The Sassoons developed a three-layer distribution system that maintained legal deniability while ensuring drug delivery. Layer 1. Floating warehouses. Sassoon ships would anchor offshore in designated areas, outside Chinese territorial waters, but accessible to smugglers. These ships became floating drugstores, where Chinese merchants could purchase opium without technically entering foreign territory or having foreigners enter Chinese jurisdiction. Layer 2. Comprador networks. The Sassoons employed Chinese compradors, local agents who handled illegal distribution. These weren't employees in the legal sense. They were independent contractors who bought opium wholesale and assumed all legal risk for distribution inland. If Chinese authorities caught them, the Sassoons could claim no responsibility. This system was brilliant for maintaining deniability. British diplomats could honestly say foreign merchants weren't directly violating Chinese law. They were selling to Chinese merchants offshore, and what those merchants did afterward wasn't foreign responsibility. Chinese officials understood this was fiction, but the legal structure made enforcement nearly impossible. Layer 3. Inland distribution networks. The compradors didn't sell directly to users. They had their own networks of sub-distributors who moved opium into China's interior. These networks reached hundreds of miles inland, far beyond treaty port jurisdiction. The Sassoons never directly controlled these networks, but they financed them through credit systems. Here's where the business model gets truly sophisticated. The Sassoons didn't just sell opium for cash, they sold on credit with interest. A comprador would buy 100 chests of opium, pay 30% up front, and owe the remainder in 90 days with 15% interest. This credit system served multiple purposes. First, it increased total sales volume. Compradors could buy more opium than they had immediate cash for, expanding the market. Second, it generated interest income on top of product sales. The Sassoons were functioning as both merchants and lenders. Third, it gave them leverage over compradors. If you owed the Sassoons money, you couldn't easily switch to competitors. Fourth, defaults gave them asset seizure rights. This last point was crucial. When compradors defaulted, which happened regularly, the Sassoons would seize collateral, typically real estate or business properties. Over decades, they accumulated massive property holdings across China, not through direct purchase, but through defaulted drug loans. They were simultaneously drug dealers, lenders, and real estate speculators. The financing mechanisms extended further. The Sassoons established banking operations specifically to support opium trade. Sassoon Banking Company provided currency exchange, trade credit, and payment processing for the entire supply chain. This meant they extracted fees at multiple points. They charged for the opium, charged interest on credit, charged currency exchange fees, charged banking transaction fees. Break down a single transaction. A Chinese merchant buys 100 chests of opium worth 200,000 rupees. He pays 60,000 rupees up front, Sassoon profit on the sale. He borrows the remaining 140,000 rupees at 15% interest, 21,000 rupees interest income. He pays in Chinese silver taels, which the Sassoon bank converts to rupees at rates favorable to the bank. Another 3 to 5% fee. Total Sassoon profit on this single transaction, roughly 85,000 rupees on a 200,000 rupee sale, 42% profit margin. No wonder they got so rich so fast. These weren't normal commercial margins. These were monopoly margins backed by imperial power and financial complexity that competitors couldn't match. Now consider risk management. The opium business faced enormous risks: piracy, storms, Chinese enforcement, British political changes, market price fluctuations. The Sassoons managed these risks through diversification and hedging that was remarkably sophisticated for the 1860s. They diversified across products. Opium was 60–70% of revenue, but they also traded cotton, silk, tea, and spices. This meant that if opium markets crashed, they had alternative income streams. They diversified geographically. Operations in India, China, and Britain meant that political instability in one region didn't destroy the entire enterprise. They hedged currency risk obsessively. Trade between India and China involved rupees, Chinese taels, and British pounds. Exchange rates fluctuated constantly. The Sassoons maintained accounts in all three currencies and used primitive derivatives, promissory notes payable in specific currencies at future dates, to lock in favorable exchange rates. They also used insurance creatively. British insurance companies wouldn't explicitly insure opium cargo, too politically sensitive. The Sassoons would insure ships and cargo as trade goods without specifying opium. If a ship sank, they'd claim it was carrying silk and cotton, which it often was, in smaller quantities, and collect insurance while not mentioning the opium that represented 90% of actual cargo value. This wasn't technically fraud, it was strategic ambiguity. Insurance contracts didn't require complete cargo manifests. The Sassoons provided enough documentation to process claims without highlighting the illegal portions of cargo. British insurance companies pretended not to know what was really being shipped, and everyone profited from the arrangement. Labor management was another hidden complexity. The Sassoons employed thousands of people across multiple continents, speaking different languages, following different laws. Managing this workforce required sophisticated administrative systems. They divided operations into ethnic and religious compartments. In India, Hindu and Muslim workers handled physical labor and basic processing. Parsi clerks managed bookkeeping and administrative work. Jewish family members and trusted co-religionists controlled financial operations and strategic decisions. In China, compradors handled distribution. But British employees, often Jewish or Anglo-Indian, managed warehouses and shipping. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It reduced risk of any single group understanding the entire operation. Workers knew their specific role, but not the bigger system. It created cultural separation that prevented labor organizing across ethnic lines. It ensured that the most sensitive financial information stayed within the trusted circle of family and co-religionists. They also pioneered what we'd now call performance-based compensation. Warehouse managers received bonuses based on inventory accuracy. Ship captains got paid extra for fast deliveries and accurate intelligence reports. Compradors earned commissions on sales volume. This aligned employee incentives with company profit maximization in ways that were unusual for 1860s business operations. Quality control extended beyond just product consistency. The Sassoons tested employees constantly for honesty and competence. They would send fake orders to see if employees processed them correctly. They would plant false intelligence to see if information leaked to competitors. They would conduct surprise inspections of warehouses and ships. Employees who failed these tests were fired immediately, often publicly, pour encourager les autres. This created a culture of fear and efficiency. Everyone knew they were being watched and tested. Performance standards were high, and consequences for failure were severe. This sounds harsh by modern standards, but it made Sassoon operations notably more efficient than competitors who used more relaxed management approaches. Tax optimization was another area where the Sassoons excelled. They operated across multiple jurisdictions: British India, Chinese treaty ports, Hong Kong, and Britain itself, each with different tax regimes. They structured operations to minimize total tax burden through strategic entity placement. Profits generated in China were routed through Hong Kong, lower tax rates, before being sent to India or Britain. Indian operations were structured to maximize deductions for business expenses that included questionable items like mansion maintenance and religious institution funding. British operations were often held in trusts that minimized inheritance taxes. This wasn't illegal. It was sophisticated tax planning using every available loophole. The Sassoons employed accountants and lawyers specifically to optimize tax structures. They moved money between jurisdictions based on where tax treatment was most favorable. They kept multiple sets of books: public records showing minimal profits, internal records showing actual earnings. The British government tolerated this because the Sassoons paid enough taxes to matter, while using legal optimization strategies that British aristocrats also used. As long as they weren't committing obvious fraud, tax minimization was considered smart business rather than evasion. Political risk management required constant attention. The Sassoons operated in China at the pleasure of British military power, which meant British policy changes could destroy their business overnight. They managed this through comprehensive political lobbying that was far-reaching and expensive. They donated to British political parties, funded British officials' pet projects, provided interest-free loans to officials facing financial difficulties, and hired well-connected Britons as employees and advisors. This wasn't crude bribery, it was building relationship networks where British officials felt obligated to consider Sassoon interests when making policy decisions. They also cultivated relationships with British newspapers and opinion leaders. Journalists who wrote favorably about Asian trade received access to Sassoon parties and information. Critics faced social ostracism and loss of access. The Sassoons couldn't completely control British media, but they could influence it enough to make sure anti-opium arguments faced pro-trade counter-arguments. In China, political management was trickier. The Sassoons couldn't openly lobby Chinese officials. That would have been too obvious and would have violated both Chinese law and British treaty obligations. Instead, they worked through compradors who had relationships with local officials. The compradors would bribe officials, and the Sassoons would ensure compradors had enough profit margin to afford those bribes. This created plausible deniability. If Chinese officials were caught accepting bribes, the trail led to Chinese merchants, not to foreign companies. The Sassoons were just selling products to independent merchants. They had no control over what those merchants did with Chinese officials. Of course, this was fiction, but it was legally defensible fiction. The financial architecture supporting all this was remarkable. The Sassoons essentially created a parallel banking system optimized for opium trade. They issued their own credit instruments, maintained currency reserves, processed international payments, and provided financial services to the entire opium supply chain. Their banking operations weren't just support for opium trade, they became profitable in their own right. Other merchants needed banking services for Asian trade, and Sassoon banks served them while extracting fees. This diversified revenue streams and created legitimate businesses that helped launder opium profits into respectable finance. By the 1880s, E.D. Sassoon Banking Company was processing transactions for hundreds of merchants, most of whom weren't involved in opium at all. The bank had become infrastructure, essential financial plumbing for Asian commerce. This gave the Sassoons power beyond just opium dominance. They controlled payment systems that other businesses depended on. The technological sophistication was also notable. The Sassoons were early adopters of telegraphic communication, which revolutionized long-distance trade. Before telegraphs, coordinating between Bombay, Shanghai, and London took months via letter. Telegraphs reduced that to days. The Sassoons used this speed advantage ruthlessly. They could learn about Chinese market conditions and adjust Indian shipments before competitors received the same information via mail. They could respond to British policy changes faster than rivals. They could coordinate currency arbitrage across 3 continents in real time. This technological edge was expensive. Telegraph fees were substantial, but it paid for itself through better market timing and faster decision-making. Competitors who relied on mail-based communication were always operating on outdated information, while the Sassoons acted on current intelligence. Record-keeping was another hidden advantage. The Sassoons maintained detailed records of every transaction, every shipment, every employee, every market price fluctuation. This data allowed them to identify patterns that competitors missed. They could see which Chinese regions had growing demand before it became obvious. They could identify which compradors were reliable versus risky. They could spot market trends early and adjust strategies accordingly. This data-driven approach was unusual for the 1860s, 1880s. Most merchants operated on intuition and experience. The Sassoons operated on recorded evidence and pattern analysis. This gave them systematic advantages that compounded over time. The opium economy's mechanics were far more complex than grow drugs in India, sell in China, get rich. It required chemical processing expertise, sophisticated logistics, multi-layer distribution networks, creative financing, risk management across multiple dimensions, strategic labor management, tax optimization, political lobbying, banking infrastructure, technological adoption, and data-driven decision-making. The Sassoons didn't just sell opium, They built a complete ecosystem for converting Indian agriculture into Chinese addiction into British pounds, with profit extraction at every stage. Understanding this system explains their dominance. Competitors couldn't just match them on opium quality or shipping efficiency. They'd have to replicate the entire integrated system, which required decades of development and massive capital investment. This is why the Sassoon monopoly lasted so long, even though opium trade was theoretically open to any merchant. The barriers to entry weren't legal, they were operational. Building comparable infrastructure required resources and expertise that few possessed. And when British policy finally turned against opium, the Sassoons survived longer than competitors because they'd built diversified operations funded by opium, but not exclusively dependent on it. Their banking, real estate, and manufacturing operations continued even as opium revenue declined. The mechanics of the opium economy reveal something important. Generational wealth isn't built through single brilliant decisions, but through comprehensive systems that extract maximum value from every aspect of operations. The Sassoons didn't get rich from good opium prices. They got rich from controlling every link in a supply chain that spanned continents and touched every aspect of Asian commerce. Those mechanics are gone now. The processing facilities are closed. The ships are scrapped. The warehouses have been repurposed or demolished. The comprador networks have dissolved. The banking operations have been absorbed into other firms or disappeared entirely. But the wealth those mechanics generated remains, dispersed across descendants who have no idea how the system actually worked. They inherited the results without understanding the machine that produced them. The empire's complexity has been forgotten along with its existence, leaving only the consequence: money without memory, wealth without understanding of its origins. So we've seen how a family of refugees fleeing Baghdad became the dominant force in 19th century Asian trade, built a fortune on opium that would equal hundreds of billions today, shaped the development of Mumbai and Shanghai, married into British nobility, and then vanished so completely that their name means nothing to most people 80 years after their empire dissolved. Today, 160 years after the Sassoons reached their peak dominance, their legacy is everywhere and nowhere. The Peace Hotel in Shanghai hosts tourists who have no idea it was built with opium money. Mumbai fishermen work docks named for a merchant whose business they've never heard of. Students study in Sassoon libraries without knowing who funded them. The infrastructure remains useful, while the creators are forgotten. Chinese scholarship on the Sassoons is extensive and unflattering. They're case studies in how foreign merchants exploited semi-colonial conditions to extract wealth while causing social devastation. They're examples of how commercial networks operated under imperial protection to damage Chinese sovereignty. They're villains in narratives about the century of humiliation. Indian scholarship is more nuanced. The Sassoons employed tens of thousands of Indians, funded institutions that still serve public purposes, and contributed to Mumbai's transformation from colonial port to modern metropolis. They were exploiters, yes, but also builders. They extracted wealth but also left infrastructure. British scholarship barely acknowledges them. They're footnotes in opium trade histories, minor characters in accounts of the British Empire in Asia. They don't fit comfortable categories. They were too successful to dismiss, too controversial to celebrate, too Jewish to be typical British merchants, too British to be typical Jewish merchants. The real lesson here isn't that the Sassoons were uniquely evil or uniquely brilliant. It's that they understood their historical moment perfectly. They recognized that the British Empire needed tax revenue, that China was vulnerable to foreign commercial penetration, that opium was uniquely profitable, and that infrastructure control mattered more than product control. They executed that understanding ruthlessly and effectively. They also demonstrated that generational wealth built on morally compromised industries eventually faces reckoning. Not necessarily legal reckoning, they never faced prosecution, but historical reckoning. The wealth dispersed. The empire collapsed. The name was forgotten. Their descendants live comfortable lives as minor British aristocrats, far removed from the opium warehouses that funded their inheritances. Whether we like it or not, the Sassoon story is relevant now. Modern wealth concentration follows similar patterns. Identify profitable but controversial industries, Build infrastructure advantages, cultivate political protection, diversify into respectable ventures, hope time obscures origins, technology giants, pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors. The strategies aren't fundamentally different, just the specific industries. So the question remains, 150 years from now, which contemporary wealthy families will be forgotten like the Sassoons? Which